10-inch racks are awesome. They're much more compact than traditional server racks, so it's much easier to find a place for them to live at home. Plus, they're the perfect size for lots of consumer switches, routers, mini PCs, and more. And if you watched my last video on 10-inch racks, you'll also know one of the best things about them is just how easy they are to customize. With most consumer 3D printers, you can churn out custom mounts and adapters for whatever hardware you've got, building the exact setup that you want. But why stop at just 3D printing pieces for a rack when you could just 3D print the entire rack? I have an upcoming project that I'd like to build in a 10-inch rack, and after looking at some of the incredible designs from various creators, I decided that I wanted to 3D print my next rack rather than buying a manufactured model like the DeskPi T0. But I couldn't decide which one was the best fit for my project, so I just printed off a bunch of them. Today I'm going to walk you through my experience printing, assembling, and building inside 3 different 3D printed rack designs, and at the end I'll share whether I decided to stick with one of those models for my project, or if I just decided to go with a pre-built rack instead. Let's get started. I don't want to spoil anything for a future video, but for the project I had in mind, I only needed a 4U rack, so that's the size I decided to focus on for each build. But I should note that all 3 of these designs can be expanded beyond that, and a couple of them can actually be scaled down to smaller than 4U. The first design is actually the first one I ever came across, which is the Mod 10. This was designed by Alan over at the YouTube channel Mandic Really, and it seemed like a really solid and simple design. Next up is the Lab Rax from Michael Clements. I chose this one because, well, it just looks really dang cool. Oh, and I should note that while the other models are 4U, the default design for the Lab Rax is 5U, and that seemed close enough, so I decided to just roll with it. The last design comes from the YouTuber Mr. P, which seemed to take a much different approach and looked like it was worth checking out. I don't think this design itself actually has a name, but it was designed and built for Mr. P's cluster, which he calls Galaxy 2.0, so I'm just calling this the Galaxy. Now obviously, I've already printed, assembled, and worked inside each of these 3 designs, and without spoiling anything just yet, I can say that each have their own unique features and do different things really well. They also have some unique challenges though. One challenge I haven't had to deal with though is finding a solid VPN provider thanks to private internet access, the sponsor of today's video. As many of you know, a VPN is a really helpful tool to have in your tech tool belt. It helps keep your network traffic private, so for example, your ISP can't throttle packets from certain domains. It's also handy when you need to access websites or content that aren't available in your region. And sure, I know many of you watching this video have already set up your own VPN servers, and that's great, me too. But PIA works really well as a backup, and also gives you access to tons of different servers across 91 different countries. I've been using PIA for quite a while now, and it's been absolutely rock solid. I love that I can use it on all my devices, from my phone to my laptop running Fedora, and even on my servers. In fact, one of my favorite ways to use PIA is by setting it up as a VPN provider for a Docker container called Gluten. This lets you easily and automatically tunnel a bunch of other containers through PIA's servers. I've been running that setup for like 1.5 years now, and like I said, I haven't had a single issue. Plus, PIA has a strict no-logs policy that's been verified by multiple third-party audits. So if you're looking for a reliable, affordable, and feature-rich VPN, make sure to check out PIA by using my link in the description. That'll get you 83% off, plus an extra 4 months for free. Now the first thing to talk about when it comes to 3D printed racks is, well, printing them. I printed all 3 of these with my Bambu Lab X1 Carbon, and I used Overture PETG for everything except for a few parts that I printed in TPU on my A1 Mini. First up was the Mod 10, which was fairly simple to print. There aren't a ton of different parts, and all of the models can be printed as is with no supports needed. On the print bed of my X1 Carbon, I potentially could have gotten 2 of these side panel pieces to fit on one print, but I didn't want to risk any issues, so I just printed them separately. Now it's possible with all of these that I could have been a little bit more efficient with how I arranged things on the print bed and such, but with the Mod 10, I managed to print all the components across 6 different prints. Following the provided print settings, I printed the entire 4U rack with 920 grams of filament in around 27.5 hours. Now I should note that unlike the rest of the models, the Mod 10 will cost you $6. Alan says that the project will eventually be publicly available, but personally, I'm happy to spend a few bucks to help support a fellow creator. Next up was the Lab Rax, which has quite a few more pieces, but it was still pretty easy to print. I didn't see any specific print settings in the guide, so I just used the default settings in Bambu Studio, but I set the wall loops to 3 for a little bit of extra rigidity. With the Lab Rax, you can technically just print the frame and leave the bottom, top, and sides open, or you can add side panels either by printing them out, or by cutting wood or acrylic pieces. I chose to 3D print them, but rather than printing solid pieces, I used a technique that I learned back when I printed a NAS case. You can remove the top and bottom layers in the slicer software, leaving just an infill pattern to create a mesh. This should help with thermals, and it also cuts down on the amount of filament needed, and I guess, yeah, that might be a little bit unfair, but really, I guess one of the advantages of this design is that it just uses these simple rectangular pieces for panels, so this technique is actually really easy to do. I didn't do that with the top panel though, since with that, there's an option for a fan mount. Once again, these were all really easy to print, and I ended up using 878 grams of filament, with all the prints taking a total of 29 hours. Last up was the Galaxy, which, well, it kinda just looked like I printed out a bunch of pegboard or something, plus a couple handles and some feet. Here I used the same print settings as the Lab Rax, but because these are mostly simple flat pieces, you can print a lot of them with a thicker layer height, like 0.28mm, to speed up the process. The only issue I ran into here was finding a good way to orient the handles, and I ended up with a pretty rough finish just with how I had the supports configured. However, I decided the issue wasn't that big of a deal and wasn't worth reprinting. The design here is similar to the Lab Rax in that you don't have to print side panels. Had I just printed the empty frame, it would have taken about 20 hours and only 525 grams of filament. However, I decided to completely cover one side, which took 24.2 hours and 668 grams of filament. I didn't really worry about the other side though because, well, this doesn't have a top cover or anything, so the main benefit of having a side panel is that you can use this to attach stuff or for organization, which I'll talk about that here in a bit. Because each of these designs takes a unique approach, the assembly process and hardware required are quite a bit different for each. I started off by assembling the Mod 10, and one cool thing about this design, well, actually, it's one cool thing about all of the designs, is that they use the same hardware for assembling the rack as they do for actually mounting equipment inside the rack. So with the Mod 10, you only have to buy one type of screw and nut. The downside is that it uses cage nuts, which, well, if you've ever used them, you might already be trying to skip ahead in the video. But I actually think this works really well. Cage nuts are a standard and they're super easy to find. You might already have some on hand. And yeah, they can be a bit tricky to get in place. But using a flathead screwdriver to snap them in makes the process a lot easier, and after getting the first few in, it becomes pretty quick to get them all populated. Once all the cage nuts are in place, you can combine two of the side panel pieces together with these little connector pieces, and then you use 4 of these cross-member pieces to connect the two sides. There are a few more connectors on the front and back to really stabilize things, but you will have to wait and put the front pieces on after you have your rack hardware installed. Then you can attach the feet, top panels, and handles. And in the end, I found this design to be really rigid and sturdy. It does rattle a bit, but that's only because of the cage nuts. The Lab Rax takes a bit of a different approach. It also keeps things simple with the hardware, but rather than cage nuts, it uses heat set inserts. I've used these quite a bit on the channel, and typically I love them, but this design requires a ton of them, and it uses some of these pretty skinny M6x4mm inserts that were tough to find. I actually had to order them on AliExpress, which meant I had to wait quite a while for them to come in. Sadly, I realized after I had already printed and installed everything that there's now a hex nut version that uses regular nuts instead of inserts, which probably would have made things easier. Even still, the heatset inserts weren't too difficult to install, and it does provide a bit more of a polished look. I didn't buy a ton of them though, so I only populated the front rack rails, and I only used the top and bottom holes for each unit. There's a good guide for assembly that I followed, which basically just involves screwing together the various pieces and then sliding in the panels. The only real issue I ran into was that the holes and the handles weren't wide enough for the heads of the M6 screws that I had, so to get them snug, I just kind of had to crush the screws into the plastic a bit, but I think it worked out fine in the end. Now the Lab Rax does feel quite a bit lighter and a little bit flimsier than the Mod 10. Some of that was probably just due to the print settings I used, as well as printing these mesh side panels, but it still feels relatively sturdy though. Other than Mr. P's video where he explains the various components, I couldn't find a guide for assembling the Galaxy rack. But honestly, I didn't really need one. It's such a simple design. Interestingly, this one doesn't have any nuts or screws though. Instead, it's designed so that you can assemble the entire thing with rack studs. These are well known as an easier to use option compared to cage nuts, but they aren't exactly cheap. Fortunately, someone also came up with a 3D printed design for a sort of rack stud alternative, so I printed out a bunch of those to try out as well. For the Galaxy, you basically just attach 2 rails to a handle piece and a foot piece using the side connector pieces. And there's actually a pretty interesting design choice here where each rack rail has sort of the inner rail that you would expect for mounting hardware, but there's also this outer rail. This is used to connect those side panels, but it can also be used so that you could actually connect multiple racks side by side, which is pretty cool. After you get the two side pieces assembled, you just attach those with some other panels, and then the whole thing is pretty much assembled. But yeah, there's also a nut version of the rack rails that works perfectly with those little 3D printed bolt things, so I used those on the front. However, I found that, well, those little 3D printed bolts don't work quite as well on the rest of the design, since they tend to sort of spin around when you try to tighten them down. The rack studs stayed in place though, so for the most part, I used the rack studs to assemble the rack, and then used those 3D printed studs to mount hardware inside it. As I mentioned earlier, the side panels are optional, but I printed out a 3U and a 1U piece to fill out this one side. This way you could use this to mount cables or power adapters with zip ties or whatever you need. And this keeps the other side open so that you can easily access stuff when you're trying to work inside the rack. In the end, the Galaxy was definitely the lightest and kind of felt like the flimsiest of the three, but it's actually a bit more rigid than I was expecting for just being, this really simple, kind of flimsy looking frame. Now, I didn't fully build out and cable manage each of these, but I did drop in a few bits of hardware and wire up some networking just to get a feel for working inside each of them. Because the cage nuts were already installed, getting stuff racked up in the Mod 10 was a breeze. It's solid, simple, and I really like that. Really, the only big issue here is that depending on what you put inside and how much cable management you need to do, it might be difficult to try to work inside the rack. You can remove the top panels, but you can't remove the side panels because, well, the rack rails are the side panels. Now, I should note that there's an updated version of the Mod 10 that was published after I finished printing and testing everything, and that features a ventilated version of the side panels. But it still has some supports that might make it tricky to try to get your hands in there and such. If you opt to use the side panels on the Lab Rax, you might have the same issue of not being able to get at it from the side or the top. But one potential advantage it has is its depth. All of the other racks, including that T0 from DeskPi, have a depth of around 200 millimeters, while the Lab Rax is a bit deeper at 240 millimeters. Now, it might make it a little bit tougher to reach things that are all the way up at the front of the rack, but it does mean you have a bit more breathing room on the back for managing cables or storing power supplies. Oh, and the only real nitpick I found when actually using the Lab Rax was that these handles are just really small, so it's actually kind of uncomfortable to get your hands underneath. If you're not going to be moving this around a ton, that's not going to be an issue, but I figured it was worth mentioning. It was a bit tougher to install gear into the Galaxy just because it required putting the rack studs or those little 3D printed bolts in place. But with how open the design is, it's by far the easiest to cable manage and work inside. And if you do want to take the side panels off, because it uses this little dual rail design kind of thing, you could really easily just unscrew this, take the side panels off, work inside, and then put the side panels back on. All these racks are really cool, but it definitely took some time to get them all printed out and put together, and it would have been much quicker to just buy something like the T0 from DeskPi. Not only does that come pre-assembled, it features an aluminum alloy design with tapped holes, acrylic side panels, and it even comes with a few accessories out of the box. But it also costs $110. So how much money did I save by 3D printing my racks? Well, it does get a little bit tricky to try to come up with a firm price for each. First of all, filament prices vary, so depending on what you use and what's available, the prices are going to be a bit different. Also, it's not likely that you'll be able to find a good deal on the exact number of screws or cage nuts or rack studs that you need, so you'll probably end up having to buy more than what you actually need. And I didn't want to do the math down to the exact cost of each screw and nut, so I'll just tell you what I paid for the extra hardware. I typically buy Overture PET G in multi-packs, so a 1 kilogram spool of black or white typically runs around $12 or so. So with the Mod 10, I paid around $11 in filament. And I think you only need like 36 cage nuts to assemble a 4U version, but then you're going to need some more to actually install some hardware, and while I probably could have gotten away with like a 50 pack, I bought a 100 pack of screws and cage nuts for around $21. I also had to pay $6 for the design, so in total, the Mod 10 cost me around $38. The Lab Rax was pretty similar in terms of filament, at least with my settings, but the hardware ended up being quite a bit cheaper. However, I did have to wait a while for it to arrive from AliExpress, so keep that in mind, but in the end, I only paid around $22. The Galaxy used substantially less filament, so that only cost around $8. However, if you go with the rack studs, well, you'll end up paying more just for those than you would for either of the other two models. If you wanted to keep things as cheap as possible, you could print like 50 of those printable bolt stud things, and that would only cost you like $1.50 in filament or something like that. I actually might try redesigning a version of that has square heads so that they don't spin around as much, and those might be more useful for actually assembling the rack. So yeah, this one's going to cost you a lot more if you actually use rack studs, but if you just 3D print all of your hardware, this is only going to cost you like $10 or so, which is pretty nuts. And now I know someone's going to comment that I'm ignoring electricity costs, and yeah, I kinda am, but realistically, if I assume that my X1 Carbon is drawing around 100 watts on average while printing, even the Lab Rax, which had the longest print time, would consume around 2.9 kilowatt hours. Even if your power costs are pretty expensive, like 50 cents per kilowatt hour, that's still going to cost you less than $2, so yeah, do with that what you will. Also, I know someone's going to comment, well, you're not taking into account the cost of a 3D printer, and yeah, sure, but that's like arguing that it's cheaper to eat out because you have to account for the cost of buying a refrigerator and an oven, so anyway, clearly the cost of printing any of these is going to be substantially cheaper than buying one. Even the most expensive print and hardware ended up being less than half the price of the T0, which to me just makes 3D printing one of these a no-brainer. But which one am I going to pick? Or more importantly, which one should you pick? Well, as it often is, the answer depends. It depends on what is and what isn't important to you. So I think a helpful way to sort of wrap up my thoughts on these is to give my winner for a variety of categories. When it comes to printability and ease of assembly, I would say the Mod 10 takes the cake. You would think that those cage nuts would be a pain, and they kind of are, but it's a very simple design that's pretty tough to mess up, and you don't have to worry about sourcing super specific heat set inserts or breaking out a soldering iron. Plus, just printing out the parts is very straightforward. When it comes to aesthetics, well, it's a bit tough to argue that the Lab Rax doesn't just look amazing. Michael clearly likes to make things that are both functional and aesthetically pleasing, and I can definitely see why someone would want to show off their Lab Rax build. One thing you might be looking for, though, is something that can grow with you as your lab expands. The Mod 10 has the ability to just add middle sections without having to disassemble the bottom or top, which seems like it could be pretty useful if you need to upgrade from a 4U rack to a 6U or 8U rack. The Lab Rax can do something pretty similar, but it might be a little bit more complicated and involve removing more pieces, especially if you decided to use panels. I think the Galaxy is the clear winner here though, because not only can you expand it vertically by adding more rail sections and using some coupler pieces, but you can also expand it horizontally. I said this earlier, but this outer rail can actually function as the inner rail of another piece, so all you'd have to do is print off another set of side pieces and then make the little connectors, so now what was the outside of this rack now becomes the inside of a second rack. I think the options this gives you definitely make this the most modular and expandable. Now, if you've ever worked inside a 10-inch rack, you'll know that one of the most difficult things is just trying to get your hands inside and get everything plugged in and cable managed. And if being able to easily work on the rack is important to you, clearly the Galaxy is the best choice here as well. It's very open, it has all those extra holes for cable management and such, and if you do have side panels, you can easily remove them. The Lab Rax, however, comes in at a close second, assuming you don't add any panels. Obviously, having an open top and sides makes it easier to get inside and mess with things, but you also get that extra 40 millimeters of depth. But maybe you don't want to tinker with your rack a bunch after you get it configured, and maybe you just want it to be really sturdy and maybe even be portable. Well, if that's the case, then I think the Mod 10 is a no-brainer. It's by far the most rigid of the three, and I don't think I mentioned this, but it by far has the best handles. So really, depending on what the needs are, I could easily see either of these three being the right choice for someone. They all have unique features that set them apart, and if you just go look at pictures of other people's rack projects, you can see all three of these models used in awesome ways. But you're probably wondering what I decided to go with. And well, I landed on the Mod 10. Now I should note that the project I had in mind at the beginning of this sort of morphed a bit throughout the process of me printing these, and well, as it turns out, I'm actually going to need a 6U rack rather than a 4U rack. And well, with the Mod 10, you can easily expand the height by just adding in a 2U extension. So that made achieving 6U really, really simple. But regardless, the Mod 10 just makes the most sense for my upcoming project because, well, I'm wanting to have a really simple design in terms of cable management, so getting inside it's not that big of a deal. And it's actually going to be something that's probably going to get moved around a lot, so having something that's a bit more durable and more portable seems like a no-brainer. Plus, not only does that most recent version include more open panels that I could print off if I wanted to, it also has these optional cross members that I've already printed out and attached that function as a little keystone patch panel, so you don't have to waste one of your rack units for that, which is pretty neat. But in reality, I think I would have been happy with all three of these, and I'll have links to the designs down in the description, so check those out, but while you're down there, make sure to support the awesome creators who actually made these designs. Mandic really is becoming one of my favorite channels. He does some incredible 3D printing projects that I find fascinating, and Michael Clements makes some awesome videos on home server hardware and such, and actually has a recent update video on the Lab Rax for a NAS build. And I hadn't watched Mr. P's content until coming across the Galaxy Rack, but he has great videos as well, including some really well-made self-hosting tutorials that are definitely worth checking out. And if you want to support my channel, you can like this video or subscribe to see more, or for as little as $1 a month, you can sign up to be a raid member where you get early access to all of my videos without any ads. Plus, there's some other perks that you might find appealing as well. That's about it for this video, so as always, thank you guys so much for watching, stay curious, and I really can't wait to see you in the next one.